Help me out. Who can give me the definition of something that's a punisher? Of what is a punisher? A punisher is anything that decreases behavior, decreases the likelihood or probability of behavior. What is a reinforcer? Anything that increases the likelihood or probability of behavior. So by definition, punishment works. The issue is not does punishment work, the issue is what happens in addition to changing behavior and how does it change behavior, because we know punishment works by definition, but it only works in the presence of a punishing agent. Is it 80 or 88 that's out here? 80? Now, it's sort of like when I was driving out to Moline when I was here a few months back. It was like me getting on Interstate 5 in Oregon or California or Washington. I get on the freeway. I'm hitting the on-ramp. I know that the speed limit is 65, but I start looking around. What am I looking for? I'm looking for punishing agents. Right? Now, I don't think I'm the only one. Why do I believe that? Because the average speed on Interstate 5 has been clocked, even though the speed limit is 65, it's usually between 75 and 80. That would indicate to me that other people are also concerned about the issue of whether or not there is a punishing agent present. And when I see traffic slow down very quickly when we're in the middle of nowhere, it's not usually a traffic jam, it's usually a punishing agent. Will kids do the same thing when punished into submission? Absolutely. The behavior actually doesn't stop, it becomes more covert. It's only effective in the presence of the punishing agent. It requires greater resources. If we're going to focus on punishment as the most effective way to change behavior, it requires greater resources because there's the increasing severity spiral. I'm not going to ask you which ones of you were ever suspended when you were in school, but ever had a student say, "Is that all you can do to me? Bring it on. Hit me with your best shot." I had a student who basically said, "You know what, if you're going to send me home, make sure it's for the whole weekend because I want a good long weekend off." I said, "I'm not sending you home, but I know where you're coming from," because that's what he used to get, was sent home. When we think about functions of behavior, if the student doesn't like school, what just happened? It could probably be reinforcing because we're reinforcing what kind of behavior? Escape-motivated behavior. There's an increasing severity spiral because we'll need to punish more and more and more and bigger and bigger. It also requires constant vigilance. We have to watch all the time. Why? Because the most powerful reinforcement system is intermittent positive reinforcement, right? If we use punishment primarily, the one time that we don't punish, they were just intermittently positively reinforced. And we have systems that work this way, and they work so efficiently and effectively, but not to our better. It can also produce unintended negative consequences. Think about somebody going to a school where they're always being corrected and punished. That's not a work environment I want to go to work in. And no, students, this school is their work environment. It can damage relationships, it can increase anger and aggression as we've seen, it can increase covertness of the behavior, and it can actually add to a mean world belief system. Mean world, which is the world's a bad place. A lot of bad things happen. Adults are bad people that manipulate us into doing things, and they just punishing us into doing things. Are you familiar with something called the coercive family process? Does this sound familiar a little bit? You've seen it, even if you have not heard that term. The coercive family process really comes a lot out of work done by folks at Oregon Social Learning Center, Jerry Patterson and John Reed. They've been working on this for 40 plus years. If you look at what happens in some families, we coerce to get what we want. In some families, dad's coercing mom, mom's coercing dad, mom and dad are coercing the kids, kids are coercing the parents. And when they come to school, we go, coercion? They're just little. How can they be coercing us? How do they coerce us when they're not big kids and they're not threatening us physically? It's not a rhetorical question. What are some ways that kids that coerce us into doing what they want? with their behavior. Can you give me an example?
They cry.
They can cry.
Acting out.
Acting out.
Yelling, tantruming.
They can make your life miserable until you do what they want. And it could be as simple as actually doing what you ask them to do in some way. For example, you're in the middle of an academic assignment, the kid raises his hand, and pretty soon he's all over everywhere, and you're going, wait, I'll be with you in just a minute. And it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until you just want to make it stop, so you go over and help them. And as soon as you go over and help them, the punishment stops. They've coerced you into getting what they want. That coercive family process is something that's pretty fascinating to watch, and they bring that into schools. I will tell you that there is a rule that I think is one of the most powerful rules, if you understand this, in behavior management, which is you get more of what you pay attention to. You get more of what you pay attention to. If you want something, pay attention to it, feed it. You can even actually back up and say, if you want it, teach it. That's the prerequisite, right? If you want it, teach it, and you get more of what you pay attention to. Those two rules, if you follow those two, I think your behavior system will be much stronger as a result. Talk about corporal punishment. Yes?
I have a question. You
Yes.
were talking about how even as law-abiding adults, if there's not a police officer, we speed. How
Yes.
do we teach our kids to do the right thing when nobody's looking, when we don't even do it ourselves?
Self-management. That's a tough one, isn't it? We can talk just a minute about self-management. Self-management is the ability to monitor our own behavior, be aware of a goal, and figure out what it takes to get from where we're at to where we're going, and decide whether or not what we're doing, whether or not we're committed to doing that. Self-management is largely based on internal tapes that run inside of us. I'll tell you, I joke with my dad, because my dad gave me quite a few tapes over the years. One of his favorites was, if a job's worth doing, a job's worth doing well. Have you heard this saying? And you know, as a kid, I would go, Dad would say, son, if a job's worth doing, a job's worth doing well. And I'd say, thank you, Dad, what didn't I do right? Right? But you know what's exciting now? Is when I do something, I say, if a job's worth doing, a job's worth doing well. I want to do a good job at this. And I can look back at it, and I can say, actually, my parents live out in the country. My dad and I laid, 600 yards of 2x6 fence. It's perfect. We're perfectionists, sometimes to the point of pain. You can look down those fences, they're just straight as an arrow. And they follow the contour of the land. They're beautiful. And sometimes when Dad and I get home, we'll drive into the driveway, my dad will just stop, and he'll look at it and say, isn't that nice looking? Why? Because there's a tape in my head. Because I've started pairing certain things. And one of the things we have to do as students is give them tapes in their head that benefit them. A lot of our kids have tapes running in their head that don't benefit them at all, right? And you see this more and more in my experience. I see it more and more in shopping centers and playgrounds and things. You'll see the kid where mom steps up and goes, would you just shut up? Just shut up. Leave me alone. Just shut up. And you go, oh, it hurts. It hurts my head. It hurts my heart to hear that. You're so stupid. Leave it alone, you little brat. Wow. What are those tapes about? You think about the kid that carries that tape. I can't wait until summer is over so that I can send you back to school and get rid of you. What awful tapes. What are the tapes that could move students from being externally managed to being internally managed? You pair it with positive reinforcement and a cognitive tape. So here's a question for you. What two messages, if kids look back 5 or 10 years from now, what two messages would you like to say? I remember Mrs., is it Merrim? I remember her. She used to always say, there's the tape. My dad will say, I never met Dr. Wolfkill, but he'll say, Dr. Wolfkill used to say, he learned something. There was a tape. Now, I don't always agree with it, but it was, deny yourself today's pleasures for tomorrow's gain. That's a very 30s, 40s, 50s sort of Depression-era saying. I think it can really benefit, but he's got that tape deeply buried in his head. What are the tapes that you want your students to connect with you? Here is an example of a tape that I used to like with the kids that struggled. Ever have a kid that he'd look at an assignment? So you give him an assignment to do, and he'd look at it and go, "You want me to do this? This is ridiculous. I can't do this. This is stupid." Have you ever seen students do that? They haven't even started on it. And what the message is in their head is, you can't do it. You're incompetent. You're stupid. And they've got all these tapes running in their head. Here's the tape that I like to give. If I see a difficult assignment, I'll give it my best shot. If I can't do it, I'll ask for help and we'll do it together. I would say it over and over and over. Once I knew that they knew it, I would say, "You tell me, what's the message that I'm going to give you right now?" Until they could say it over and over. Why? Because I want that message embedded. It becomes a self-management strategy. That's one tool that I think can be very useful. Do you know what the matching law is? The matching law by Richard Herrnstein says that the rate of a behavior matches the rate of reinforcement. What does that mean? If in a classroom I give 20 units of reinforcement for being on task, and the peers give 80 units for being off task, who's going to win that one? Do you follow the logic here? If they're getting more reinforcement for inappropriate behavior, you will get more inappropriate behavior. You will get the behavior that is being reinforced, the behavior that is working, the behavior that is functional. Now, a lot of people struggle with the concept of reinforcement, because you'll hear people sometimes say, "I'm not going to reinforce them for what they should be doing." Really? Really? So let me just check with you. And I'm just using you in the generic sense, right? Let me just check in with you and ask, so I don't need to send you your paycheck? Remember, this is students' job. They're coming to work. School is their job. What's their payoff for this? And you say, well, paycheck isn't the only reason I do it. Probably not. What would happen if they stopped sending it, though? Well, but that's not real, because I need to support my family and pay. Kids need a payoff too. And actually, we can talk about the business literature and what that shows. But let's just take it out of the paycheck realm, because that may be unfair. Let's put it in the personal realm. How many of you would be just fine if nobody gave you any tangibles on February 14th, December 25th, or another particular day that you might value during the year? We all have a pretty rich reinforcement and recognition schedule. We need to make sure that kids do too. And in fact, lest you think that this is only the touchy-feely people from Eugene, Oregon, who like to get together, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya, you know who has a regular token system of reinforcement? That wussy organization we call the military. They're ahead of us on this. Do you know that they have tokens in the military? Yeah. Ask somebody if they don't have a unit token that they can get from an officer if an enlisted person goes above and beyond. They'll say, I actually was in Klamath Falls, Oregon, back about a year ago now, and there was a bunch of Air Force folks in there, and I asked this guy, I said, "Do you know what I'm talking about? I've heard that there are tokens that officers can give out. What's that about? Do you know what I'm talking about? Am I completely off base?" He goes, "No, that's my wife up there in line." He said, "Go ask her for hers." I went up and asked her. She reached into her pocket, pulled out this beautiful coin, and she said, "That's mine. You can look at it, but don't touch it." I said, I'm not moving here. I just wanted to see it. Beautiful unit token. I said, "What's that for?" She goes, "An officer gave that to me when I was doing something that he appreciated. I've carried it now for 2 years." Let's talk about the business field, because the business literature is actually in some ways ahead in looking at outcomes. There are 2 resources that you might want to write down. There's a book that's a little softer and less evidence-based. It's called Managing to Have Fun by Matt Weinstein. Managing to have fun. And they talk about, in the business world, in the manufacturing world, you can increase the bottom line by making sure your employees are playing and having fun. I was just at an awards ceremony 3 nights ago, and it is by Sayusla Bank and Financial Group. Their founder gives every employee 2 weeks a year to perform voluntary service. Any organization that they value. It doesn't make any difference. He doesn't care who it is, but there has to be a voluntary service to the community in some way. He says, I come back with the most motivated, excited employees in the world. And his employees love him. Here's another book that you might want to consider. This is actually very fascinating work, and it is a book called How Full Is Your Bucket? And the authors are Rath, R-A-T-H, and Clifton, C-L-I-F-T-O-N. And what they did was they looked at, I want to say it was millions of employees across hundreds of business units. And what they found was that employees who received regular recognition and reinforcement did better jobs. Less damage, less injury, less illness, less customer service complaints. All these things that we want in schools, if we want kids to be successful, we need to make sure that we're providing good, positive reinforcement schedule for them. Why don't we reinforce more? If you see a student walking in the hallway, are you more likely to notice, if you see students in the hallway, are you more likely to notice the student running or the student walking? We're hardwired to notice things that pose a threat to us. Since there aren't a lot of lions and tigers and bears, well, maybe there's some bears here, but lions and tigers anyway, as long as there's not something posing a physical threat to us, what we notice is things that pose a social threat. Oftentimes, when I walk into a school setting, what I notice is that the best way to get attention is inappropriate behavior. And if a student in your classroom or school wants to get attention, individualized attention, probably the best way is to act inappropriate. That's the way schools often operate. So one of the questions is, are we hardwired? Yes, we might be. We need to change that focus and say, can I pay more attention to the things that I want more of? There's also social contingencies and political contingencies at play. But there's a lot of reasons why we don't reinforce more. Okay, so one of the traditional ways of dealing with antisocial or aggressive behavior is punishment-based. Another one is medication. And I want to tell you right up front, I'm not opposed to the use of medication. I worked in an ADHD clinic for a year. I think medication is at times a very appropriate intervention. But it's rarely the right intervention if not combined with a behavioral intervention. And we need to see that as not leaving kids stuck there. I wanted to just show you a little video clip. And maybe you'll recognize this when I asked, who's the medication for?
As a mom with 3 active kids, I've got to make sure I know what they're up to at all times. And as any mom will tell you, they can be irritable. That's why I give my kids Kidstone Chewable Valium.
Kidstone Chewable Valium, the with the whole family can enjoy.
And once the Kidstone Chewable Valiums kick in, these kids kind of stay right where you put them. They're quiet, relaxed. It's a dream. And just about all you have to do is check their breathing every once in a while.
Kidstone Chewable Valium, for the makers of nitrous oxide balloon animals.
I just had to inject a little bit of my humor there. I think it's important for us to answer the question, who's the medication for? And is the desired outcome that our kids are still quiet and docile? Or is it that they're better able to learn? In fact, there's some things that we know about medication with ADHD. One of those things is it's not related to body weight or body mass, the appropriate dosage. And what's also more interesting is the appropriate dosage is determined by the outcome you want. The appropriate or best dose for academic improvement may be entirely different than the best dose for social behavioral improvement. So it's important, and all I'm saying is, I'm not saying medication isn't a good thing, but I'm saying we have to be very careful about whether or not we're serving our interests or the interest of students. Another intervention that is traditional and does not work is seclusion. Sending students away. You know what seclusion does? Seclusion is what we've done to students with disabilities historically. And what it does is it puts them further from what they need most, which is relationship, connection, and the ability to be impacted by the social interactions of people around us. On the last one, I want to be very, very clear here. I am not speaking against counselors when I say this. Counseling and psychotherapy are very powerful interventions that can be used appropriately in many places, but the evidence has not supported the use of counseling and psychotherapy with aggression, with the issue of managing aggression and antisocial behavior. We need to, and we're starting to target this more and more in the counseling and clinical areas, starting to target more and more when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. For the kids for whom you're going to do an FBA, traditionally psychotherapy and counseling, traditional counseling, are not the appropriate interventions. There's a lot of evidence to back this up. There are other times and places when that's the appropriate intervention. This is not one of them. There are other things that counselors, psychologists, psychotherapists, others can do that are helpful. Now, I can't remember who it was that talked about, can we make kids worse in the ED programs? The answer is absolutely yes. If you look at the work of Tom Dishon, D-I-S-H-I-O-N, Tom Dishon did some work around what happens when we put kids with antisocial and aggressive behavior together in groups. And the problem is they often get worse because they're better teachers than we are. They network better, they're more powerful in their use of reinforcers and punishment. But we get what's called iatrogenic effects. We go in to make things better and things actually get worse. Am I saying that those situations shouldn't be done? No, but we need to be very careful about using interventions that are effective and efficient. What are some things that work? Now, I've made a list that goes across 3 slides here. And I'm going to run through these fairly quickly because we're not going to speak about most of them very much. But I'm going to start with communication of high expectations. One of the most powerful things you can do is believe in your students and communicate that to them. You go, well, that's pretty basic. It is pretty basic, and it's not something historically that education has done well. Communication of clear boundaries. This is okay, that is not okay. Many of our students have failed in programs because the boundaries moved all over everywhere. As I've traveled around this country, there are 2 incredibly hot topics in education. Should students be allowed to chew gum and wear hats in school? I'm not kidding. These things are conversations that people will almost come to blows over. And here's where it plays out in the student population is, you have a rule against wearing hats, but Mr. Jones says it's fine in his classroom, and you have a rule against not chewing gum, but Mrs. Smith said I can chew gum in her classroom, I don't care. Clear boundaries have just been lost, and now what we have is a system that's broken, not a student. It is not a problem of student behavior, it's a problem of systems behavior. Effective transitions, taught and supported. A positive environment where there's high rates of positive, low rates of negatives. Systems of support rather than punishment. Attitudes and practices of inclusiveness. If you look at the Secret Service and the FBI reports about school shooters, you know what the profile of a school shooter is? There isn't one. We can't predict who the next school shooter is going to be. What we do know is that there are schools that are more or less likely to be involved in violence based on 2 basic characteristics. One of those is your school inclusive or exclusive? Inclusivity is it's my school, it's our school, we're all in this together. I feel like I belong there. Exclusivity is it's your school, or I don't belong there. There's all these cliques and I'm not part of anything. The other is the school primarily positive in its management system or primarily punitive and negative? Genuine concern for all students. I just heard something that was horrifying about a year ago. There was a kiddo being bullied, terribly bullied and harassed by many, many students in the school. One of the students told their teacher, "It's okay to bully this kid, everybody knows that." And the teacher said, "What do you mean everybody knows that? The kids are telling you it's okay?" "Well, all the kids know it's okay, the adults are telling us that." He said, "I took a step back and I asked, what do you mean the adults are telling you it's okay to bully?" He said, "Well, we always hear the teacher saying he brings it on himself. They see it and they don't intervene." Do we have a genuine concern for all students? We need to communicate. We're here to support all students. We will find a way to support all students. We care about all students. Use of research-based, field-tested curriculum, an evidence-based instructional model, academic programming matching the skill level, student skill level, frequent progress monitoring, frequent feedback to the student, adaptation of the program as indicated, additional support for some students as indicated. Proactive preventive focus rather than reactive and negative, and use of evidence-based universal social skills curriculum. How many of you use a universal social skills curriculum in your program or your school? What do you use?
We use a lot of things, actually, but it's the school itself uses maybe ABA as a behavioral math.
Okay, okay.
But then on top they have character counts program.
Okay.
Could you speak louder, please?
So they use an ABA structure and they use character counts as the social skills component in it. Let me tell you, one of the things that is very clear in the research in social skills training is universal social skills training for, universal meaning all students, is a very powerful intervention. It is part of a PBS model, and when we talk about the kids going up to the small group, the yellow zone interventions, or up to the red zone interventions, we need to make sure we have good universal interventions in place first. Social skills curriculum and your choice of curricula is incredibly important. One of the things that we found is there is a reason why some curricula are not making the impact in student behavior. And the reason for that is they're not teaching behavior, they're teaching concepts, which is fine. You can teach concepts, you can teach the ideas, but if you want to change more than the answers on the test, you have to teach the behavior. And one of those behaviors that's critical is empathy. If your social skills curriculum is not teaching empathy, you're giving kids skills that they're unlikely to use. There's a couple of those. I personally like Second Step and Steps to Respect out of the Committee for Children. I think it's one of the best developed programs there. If you want to go online and see it, I think their website is CF Children, as in Committee for Children, cfchildren.org. And look for Second Step and Steps to Respect. Peace Builders was another one, although I think Peace Builders may be going out of business. It seems that the two co-founders couldn't resolve problems peacefully and they may be parting ways. There are others, but make sure they're evidence-based, that they've been developed based on the evidence, they've been field tested. Here's what I'd like you to do. Turn to somebody next to you. What's one thing that doesn't work in managing antisocial behavior, and what are 3 things that do work? Now I have to tell you, just a quick prompt, you can't cheat because you are allowed to go back and use your notes. Okay, so use the resources, go back in the packet. What are 3 things that do work and 1 thing that does not work in managing antisocial behavior? Please. Do you know why I do a countdown? Predictability. Anytime that you can't increase consistency, increasing predictability is a good piece of it. There is one other reason as well. We often ask students to violate social norms. And the social norm in speaking is, if Helene and I are talking, if I'm speaking, I will finish my thought, and if she's listening, she will nod and smile and make eye contact with me. And when we say, immediately now, you need to stop what you're doing and turn your attention to me, I've just asked the speaker and the listener to violate social norms. So there's 2 things, increasing predictability and avoiding asking students to violate social norms. Another place that we do that is we put kids in a group the first thing in the morning and ask them not to talk to each other. What we find is doing a quick check-in is a way to avoid violating social norms to meet the social need. Okay. I want to just take this for a second into a big context, and then we're going to start moving very small, very quickly here. High-performing schools are different. High-performing schools are different not in who they serve or where they're located. They're different in what they do. They're different in leadership and management, academics, and the social behavior program. Now, I'm not going to go through this list. You can do this later, but I want to point out one thing on here that I think makes a huge difference. Actually, let me mention 2. One is being vision-driven. You need to have a vision for what you want in your classroom, your program, or your school. Do you know what it would look like if your classroom, program, or school was running perfectly? What would it look like? What would students be doing? What would the adults be doing? Having a clear vision for what you want, where you're going, is very powerful. I want to skip over to the social behavior side here, and I want you to look at this second one in the list. High-performing schools do not manage student behavior. High-performing schools do not manage student behavior. You will often hear people go, well, we have to manage student behavior so we can teach. Teach what? We have to teach things that are important. People in high-performing schools understand that social behavioral skills are what's called a cultural imperative. What does that mean? If you're not successful with these skills, the chances you'll be successful in life drop pretty quickly. We know that there's an academic skill that kids need, right? Literacy. The literacy skill set is very predictive of later success in life. If students don't have literacy skills, outcomes start looking questionable. The same thing is true of social behavior skills. Think about why kids get kicked out of school. It's not for their academics. They get kicked out for their social behavioral issues. Why do people have difficulty in relationships? Social behavioral issues. The number one reason people get fired from a job, not talking about layoffs, is their inability to get along with others. It is a cultural imperative. High-performing schools prioritize social behavior equal to academics, and they teach it like a core curricular area. Quality is never an accident. It's always the result of high intention, sincere effort, intelligent direction, and skillful execution. It represents the wise choice of many alternatives. Okay. So at this point, we're ready to move into an FBA, right? That we know that it's an evidence-based intervention that works. We're ready to do an FBA, right? Stop. Before you do an FBA, there's some things you need to have in place. Number one is, do you have a school-wide PBS system in place? Why does that matter? In systems where there is a school-wide system in place but it's not working well, what you will find is your SST or child study team is overloaded with referrals. And as they get overloaded with referrals, the squeeze goes up the system and you will get more referrals further up the level, and pretty soon you'll be asked to do more and more and more FBAs because these are kid problems. I would argue if your system at the universal and secondary level is not working, it's a systems problem in many cases that result in students ending up there. Is the classroom PBS system in place? What does that mean? At very best, at very least, you have to have clear behavioral expectations. What does that mean? 3 to 5 positively stated school rules, no more. If you've got more than that, the adults can't remember them, they can't monitor and enforce them. Those expectations must be explicitly taught and reviewed across the year. And there must be a positive system of behavioral feedback, letting kids know when they're doing the right thing and when they're not doing the right thing. So what's the relationship between PBS or PBIS and FBA-based support planning? Do you know? Could you talk about that? Now my understanding is we're having lunch at 12:15, is that correct? So we're going to go through this very quickly. And for many of you, this is going to be a review on PBS, but I want you to hear it. And I'm going to try to relate it at each step into how it relates to an FBA and a behavior support plan. What is PBS? First and foremost, PBS is a philosophical framework. It's a way of thinking about school failure or school success. It's a way of thinking about behavior, appropriate or inappropriate. I can tell when I walk into a school or a program whether or not they have the PBS way of thinking, the PBS mindset. Listen to their response. Is it to blame the student, or is it to talk about support? Are they talking about individual students, or are they talking about a system and the environment? It's a philosophical framework. It structures what we do. Well, let's talk about what are some of the core components. Number one, it's a systems approach for enhancing capacity. It means we do things in teams rather than individuals. Right? We have a feudal system in education, not futile. But remember the old system of lords and ladies, and they each had their own kingdom? That's what education has been for years. And the problem is we're very isolated and not working together. How does this relate to FBA? An FBA should never be done by an individual. You can tell them Dale said so. Okay? I'm just telling you, an FBA best practice in this is that we work together. That we're doing this together, that we use that concept that three heads or more heads are better than one. Why do we do that? Well, in a large systems perspective, it's because of consistency. And how many of you own dogs? Anybody own cats? This has no application to cats, but that's not entirely true. So dog rules. Dog rule number 1, the dog is not allowed in the house. Dog rule number 2, okay, the dog is out in the house, but only in certain rooms. 3, okay, the dog is allowed in all the rooms but must stay off the furniture. 4, okay, the dog can get on the old furniture. Fine, the dog is allowed on all the furniture but is not allowed to sleep with the humans on the bed. Okay, the dog is allowed on the bed, but only by invitation. 7, the dog can sleep on the bed whenever he wants to, but is not allowed under the covers. 8, the dog can sleep under the covers at the invitation of the humans. 9, the dog can sleep under the covers at night. And 10, humans must ask permission to sleep under the covers with the dog. If we're going to be effective, we have to work together. Because if we're not working together, oftentimes we're working in different directions. If we're building plans where people aren't working together on the plan, on the development of the plan, the implementation of the plan will often break down. We have to work together as a team. It's a process for capacity building. And FBA does not result in the answer. It results in what? A hypothesis, a best guess. And we test it. It's a process for capacity building. PBS advocates for the development and use of a continuum of behavior supports. A continuum of behavior supports. What does that mean? Have you all seen this pyramid? Where does FBA fall? Up here. The problem is, when I go into schools, a lot of times people say, if you just help me with these kids in the red zone, everything else will be fine. The fact of the matter is, if you don't create universal systems to change the culture and climate and practices of the school, you will get too many kids struggling up here, referred up there, and your support systems will be ineffective. The high-risk, intensive individual interventions have to be set in this universal culture. You start down here with the universal interventions, you build up into your selected or small group interventions, the yellow zone interventions, and then you focus on your red zone or intensive individual interventions. Why does this matter? It matters because there's more of them with greater needs than there are of us. If we start up here, we will get swamped. Make sure you have a universal system in place. I've put in your notes some examples of what the different interventions look like at the primary, secondary, and tertiary level. Okay, the next piece is PBS is prevention focused. When we start talking about your behavior support plan, we're going to say, of course we need to manage consequences, but we need to make sure that we back up and prevent the problem behavior whenever that's possible. And 2 ways to do that is make sure you have good instruction academically and make sure you have good instruction behaviorally. An FBA and a behavior support plan need to be largely about instruction for prevention. Empirically sound, using assessment information, and we need to be committed to the use of effective practices. If we're doing a program that works, we need to be very careful that we keep doing it. One of the biggest reasons why programs fail is that we fail to continue an effective program. When the problem behavior goes away, we stop having the momentum and the reason to do the intervention. Here's what I'd like you to do. Take 2 minutes with your team and answer the questions. Do you have your school-wide interventions in place? Do you have your yellow zone interventions in place? Take 2 minutes with your team right now and take a look at that. How many of you are completely comfortable that your system includes great universal interventions and great secondary or yellow zone interventions? I think it's important to go back. I would encourage you to take a look. There is a tool in There's a tool in your work packet and in your master packet that looks like this. I would encourage you to go back and talk with your PBS team or your school climate team or your administrator and look at this and maybe even fill this out. How do we identify our kids who are at risk? How do we identify our kids who are high risk? What are the interventions at the universal level that we're doing for all students? What do we do at the secondary level for our yellow zone students? And what are we doing besides FBA and behavior support plans at the red zone? Are there other things that we're looking at and doing? I would encourage you to fill this out, because if you don't have those in place, your behavior support plans become less effective. Questions do you have about PBS? That is PBS in the smallest nutshell you can put it in. Yes?
Under something you skipped, universal interventions, first is personal relationship building.
Yeah, I'm a hardcore behaviorist who absolutely totally believes that the most important thing that we do in schools is build relationships. Nothing occurs without a relationship. As a matter of fact, if you look at things that go well and things that go less than well, it's usually about a relationship. I can think back to teachers I've had. If I had a great relationship with them, good things happened. And if I had a negative relationship with them, usually negative things happened. The relationship building piece is critical. If we think that we're going to just walk in and intervene kids into success in a technical sense, I think we're going to start having problems. Relationships, relationships, relationships. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that that's not true at the secondary and tertiary level of intervention. I think they become even more important. Other questions? I believe the next activity is self-care. It is by my cell phone, 12:13. Have a half an hour for lunch. Lunch is right next door in C and D. Go out, take a left, take another left. So, eat lunch. Two. Thank you. Step aerobics. Number 3. Can you tell what color? Very good. Say it again. Orange peels. Orange PLs. Orange peels. Number 4. Twist of fate. Good. I just check in to make sure that those brain cells were still firing. Some of mine were when I came back from lunch, and some of them were not. Therefore, we have some forms on your table, some of which should be there and some of which should not.
Okay, we've got for the CEUs, there's the evaluation form and the evidence of completion form.
I love positive reinforcement and feedback and comments, but I also really appreciate corrective feedback about things that I can change. So I would encourage you to bypass comments about too hot, too cold, or the food, and cut right to where there are things that we could do to improve the presentation. I do value that and would appreciate that. So anything we need before we get going for this afternoon? You know, one of the things that I know about me is I always worry that I need to put in more information, and I always end up worrying during the presentation that I'm not moving fast enough. So we've covered a lot of ground. I will tell you that what I'm presenting today, I typically present in 2 7 to 8 hour days. So we are flying through this. I did not quite understand that we do have a range of people for whom this is their first time to people who've been through this 3 times before. So we'll keep those plates spinning as best we can. Okay. We just talked briefly before lunch about systemic approaches to supporting behavior. PBS is a systemic approach to supporting behavior. We're now going to talk about individual approaches, and what I'm going to talk about now is the escalation cycle. If we want to manage behavior escalation, we need to make sure that we plan ahead versus waiting around to respond. If you wait until a crisis occurs to respond, it's going to be a lot more challenging. It is easiest when planning to utilize a model to shape our thinking. And what I'm going to provide for you is a model based on the work of Jeff Colvin, Hill Walker, and some other folks that's been around for a number of years. You will see this if you, as being familiar if you have done PART training or MAP training or CPI training. I think most of them use a similar model. This is the 7-phase model. And you are going to see the 7 phases listed here of, calm, trigger, agitation, acceleration, peak, de-escalation, and recovery. Let's take, what are some of the signs in the calm phase? In the calm phase, your students can be on task. Now, escalation of behavior is not the only reason why a student might be off task. But they can be on task during the calm phase. They can follow rules, they can respond to praise, they can initiate appropriate behavior, and they can be goal-oriented during the calm phase. Lots of possibilities available. From a neurological point of view, we want our kids up in that prefrontal cortex where they're using their best logical thinking, best executive decision making. And when they become escalated neurologically, what happens is they start shifting back into that hindbrain a lot of times where we're not getting their best thinking. At this level, we've still got their best possible capacity and capability present. Now there may be triggers that come along and escalate them. Now just the fact that they have triggers in their environment does not mean they will escalate. In fact, one of the great interventions is teaching kids to ignore certain kinds of triggers or to respond in a more positive, pro-social way to triggers. There may be conflict. These are school-based triggers. There may be conflict. There may be changes in routine. And as I think it was Steve was talking about, predictability, which is why I count down. There are 2 reciprocal pieces in a program. One is predictability, and the other is consistency. If you have a system that every day is exactly the same, then it is 100% consistent, right? However, that's not very realistic, is it? At some point, you're going to have to change on some given days. You can offset a change in consistency through an increase in predictability. If I know that our schedule is always that at 11 o'clock we always have math class, but today we're not going to have math class, today we're going on a field trip to the museum. Consistency has decreased. I'm going to try to increase predictability by making sure well ahead of time they know what's coming. And I'm going to try to prepare them for that. Consistency offsetting predictability, or predictability offsetting consistency. Does that make sense? Okay, we got triggers coming along, changes in routine. It could be a provocation, a student teasing or taunting another student. Could be the pressure of a difficult assignment. Could be that they have ineffective problem-solving skills, or they've made an error or have been asked to make corrections. There are also non-school-based triggers that may come up. And in a few minutes, we're going to differentiate those when we get into the FBA piece around setting events and antecedents. Does this sound familiar to some of you? Okay. In the non-school-based thing, there may be health issues. You may have a student who normally takes medication that didn't take it, or has a medical condition that has flared up. Could be a nutrition issue. Sleep. We know now that middle school and high school students are, by and large, sleep deprived. And this is one of the things we know. My brother, as I said, is a flight safety director. Being sleep deprived is very much like being intoxicated. I think if I remember correctly, it's below 5 hours of sleep, you start acting like you've had a beer. Now think about this. I mean, you can start taking this back and start looking at what are the outcomes of behavior. And there's some really good research that NASA has done around sleep deprivation and the impact on their ability to think clearly and act appropriately. Substance abuse, gang membership, family issues, all those things may be triggers. And if the student continues up the escalation cycle, you start into the agitation phase. Now, this is a place where it becomes very important that you know the student. This is a place where if you are interacting with a student you believe is becoming agitated, if you have this option, I would encourage you at that phase to immediately get somebody who knows the student. Because the issue is not what the behavior is that you're seeing, it's whether or not that behavior that you're seeing differs from non-agitated behavior in that student. So we can talk about behavior excess and behavior deficit. Students who go into excess start getting the physical movement, the darting eyes, their communication may become non-conversational. They just blurt things out in different directions and they're not waiting around for feedback. Their hands and arms may get busy. They may increase their overall gross motor movement, and they're probably going to go back and forth between off and on task cycles, increasingly off task. That's what we recognize as agitated. Here's the problem. When some students become agitated, they go into deficit. This is actually usually predictive of a greater blow up when it does happen. These are students who simply draw inside themselves. I always say it's like the rattlesnake coiling, right? It's the student who becomes less movement, less communication, quiet, subdued language, and withdrawn. Those are the students that when they strike, it often catches people off guard. Then we move into an acceleration, beyond agitation into the acceleration. So there may be questioning, argumentative. They now become more aggressive, typically, if it goes into this place. Non-compliant, high rates of off-task behavior, provoking others, compliance with inappropriate behavior, as other kids can set them up for problem behavior. Limit testing, negative verbal such as whining or crying, avoidance and escape, running out of the room, crawling under the desk, or just physically withdrawing. At this point, you may also see threats, verbal abuse, and destruction of property. This comes right before the peak. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say is there is an assumption of linearity in this process that isn't always true. Because you may have a student that makes it up through agitation and acceleration and then cycles back and becomes calm again. So there's no guarantee that once on the cycle that they're going to continue through the entire cycle. And in fact, that's what we're trying to stop, is a continuation to higher levels of the cycle. Peak behavior is where the destruction of property becomes very serious. This is where students can become assaultive or seriously self-injurious, severe tantrums, and hyperventilation at some point. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but sometimes you'll see them hyperventilate to the point where they black out, or holding their breath till they black out. The peak can only occur for a matter of a couple, 3, 4 minutes usually at most, unless you're talking about substance abuse or mental illness. Peak behavior does not go on for 15, 20, 30 minutes or an hour. I've heard people talk about that. I don't know anybody that can document that. And the reason for that is this is very much like seizures, like a gross motor seizure. It takes a tremendous amount of arousal, a tremendous amount of energy to maintain it, and they will quickly usually cycle out of it. The question is in which direction? Do they just slow down long enough to get their second breath and start all over again? If we can bring them out the other side, we find de-escalation. And de-escalation, how many of you have seen gross motor seizures, or what used to be called grand mal seizures, the big physical flailing seizures? If you've seen that, you probably have also seen that post-ictal state where they become tired and a little bit disoriented. This actually will sometimes represent this in extreme cases. There may be confusion, there may be sort of a reconciliation phase where they're crying and trying to make things right, and sort of it's a little incoherent at times. They may withdraw, they may be in denial about what happened. They're probably going to be responsive to simple mechanical or manipulative directions, and we need to keep it very simple. Oftentimes they will avoid a discussion of events leading up to it. We're going to talk in just a minute about what you do at each stage. Finally, in the recovery phase, they start becoming subdued enough that they can re-enter work at an individual level, sometimes in a small group level. They may be able to enter in class discussions. I usually don't push that issue. Defensive behavior and avoidance of the debriefing process. So there you have sort of a little bit of a description of your 7 phases. Does this look familiar to you if you've seen the process? Let's talk about interventions at each level. If we want to create support structures or strategies, number 1 is we want a classroom structure that is effective and efficient and elicits appropriate behavior. This actually harks back to PBS. Do they have clear expectations? Actually, I was just talking with a team over lunch, and I can't remember the name of the school, but we were talking over lunch about, how do when you look at kids with problem behavior, what do I do? As a consultant, there's some very basic questions I always ask. Do you have 3 to 5 clear rules for your school or program? Back up, are the expectations clear? Have they been explicitly taught to the students? Have they been receiving lots of recognition, that's about who they are, and reinforcement about their appropriate behavior? Are they getting some small corrective feedback? That is the classroom structure that you're looking for. In addition, you want high quality instruction. The last piece is teaching social behavior. I want to say again, teaching social behavior explicitly is critical. Lower order social skills, which is your basic rules and how to get along in the classroom or the school. And 2 is higher order social skills. I talked a little bit about second step. I want to mention something else, is if you're a counselor or a social worker or a school psych and you are asked to teach social skills, my recommendation to you is to answer, I can't do that, but what I can do is I can teach your staff to do it, and I will do it with them. We are moving more and more in this field to an indirect service model where you become a teacher for your colleagues. You have the expertise in the background in teaching things like affective programs, social skills, etc. The reason why we don't do an individual teaching the social skills curriculum is there's no evidence it works. What do we know works? What works is this. What works is that everybody teaches it. Therefore, we have changed the culture and climate so everybody can use the same language, same concepts in creating a different culture in the school. If that's not happening, one person going classroom to classroom teaching the skills, we just don't see it change anything other than declarative knowledge. They can answer the right answer on the quizzes and the tests or whatever, but it doesn't change their behavior much actually out in the environment. Okay, what about during the triggers? Well, we need to look at those triggers and say, can we change those triggers? What does this look like when we're doing behavior support planning? If we're changing triggers, what part of behavior support planning does this look like? Some of you guys are veterans. You know, this is an antecedent intervention, right? We're saying what triggered the problem. It may be curricular interventions. Maybe there's not effective instruction happening in the classroom. If there's ineffective instruction, kids at risk are your canaries in the coal mine. Have you ever heard this term, a canary in the coal mine? Coal miners would take canaries down there because canaries were more sensitive to poisonous gases. If the canary fell over, best bet you ought to get out of there.